The signal came without warning. Not a weapon, not a fleet, just a sound, a low, rolling frequency that punched through every communication channel humanity had ever built, from deep space relay buoys to the cheap radios people kept in their kitchens. Every screen on every human world flickered at the same moment. Every speaker crackled with the same voice. The Volkai had found a way to speak to all of humanity at once, and they had chosen to do it in the most degrading way they could imagine. They translated their own language into human tongues, not because they respected those languages, but because they wanted every human to understand, personally, what was being said to them. Species designation, human. Classification, pre-sovereign, you have been assessed. You have been found insufficient. Under the right of dominion, you are hereby challenged. You will submit one representative for the trial of blades. Your representative will face our champion. When our champion wins, your species will enter a period of guided servitude lasting 100 years. Resistance is irrelevant. Refusal is not permitted. You have 30 days. And then the signal cut out. On a cargo freighter hauling water ice between two moons, a dockworker named Bayo put down his meal and stared at the wall for a long time. He was not a soldier. He had never held a weapon in his life. He had 3 children, a bad knee, and a mortgage on a prefabricated house on a colony that had only existed for 11 years. He sat with what he had just heard for about 40 seconds. Then he picked up his meal again and finished eating, because the ice wasn't going to haul itself, and because Bayo had the particular human quality of refusing to let something terrifying take his appetite. He posted a short video that evening. He looked directly into the lens and said calmly, "Tell them to send their best. We'll send ours." He went to bed. By morning, 4 billion people had watched it. In the Galactic Assembly Chamber, a vast ring structure orbiting a star that belonged to no single species, the hall was full. Every seat was taken. Delegations that rarely attended the same session had scrambled to be present. The Volkai announcement had reached the assembly too, and the mood in the chamber was one that older species recognized immediately. It was pity, the kind of pity that comes before a funeral. The Volkai had issued the trial of blades 11 times in recorded history. They had won 11 times. The last species to accept the challenge, the Drevosi, a proud and ancient people, had lasted 30 seconds in the arena. That was 400 years ago. The Drevosi still served Volkai administrative functions to this day. Prime Delegate Oren Vassi of Earth walked to the center podium without being called. He was a small man. He wore no medals, no ceremonial dress, none of the visual language that other species use to signal importance. He stood at the podium and waited until the hall was quiet. Then he said, "The human species accepts the challenge." Noise, immediate and enormous. Species that had never agreed on anything managed to agree that this was either the bravest or the most foolish thing they had ever witnessed. In the Volkai observation box, Grand Warlord Draven Sect turned to his aide and said nothing. He simply watched. Something about the small delegate's posture bothered him in a way he could not quite name. Vassi waited for the noise to die. Then he said calmly, "We accept under one condition. The 30-day preparation period is a right under assembly law. We invoke it fully." He paused. "We will also be submitting a formal data request for the medical and physiological profiles of previous Volkai champions. This is also our legal right under assembly transparency protocols." He picked up his papers. "Thank you." He walked back to his seat. In the observation gallery, Watcher Lu, the oldest serving assembly observer, a being so ancient that the species she had been born into no longer existed, made a small note. In 400 years of watching species, except the trial of blades, not one of them had ever asked for medical records. Not one of them had ever sounded like they were doing paperwork rather than accepting a death sentence. Back on Earth, in a secure facility built under a mountain in a region that had once been called Scandinavia, Admiral Dara Wynn stood in front of a wall of data and did not sleep. Around her, A room full of people who were very good at their jobs did the same. She had received Vassie's transmission the moment it went out. She had also received the note he sent privately afterward, which contained only 4 words. "Find me something real." Wynne looked at the Voakai physiological files that the Assembly's Transparency Office had delivered within hours of Vassie's request. 11 previous champions, 11 different physical profiles, all enormous, all fast, all decorated with kill records that read like mythology. She was not looking at the kill records. She was looking at the brain scans. She passed the scans to Dr. Siona Marsh, who was sitting in the corner eating cold rice from a container and had not spoken in 6 hours. "Tell me what you see," Wynne said. Marsh looked at the scans for a long time. Then she set down her food. "I see something very interesting," she said. Outside on 100 worlds and stations and drifting ships, humans were arguing, crying, laughing, posting videos, making plans, and in small moments of private quiet being afraid. But they were not stopping. They had never been very good at stopping. The 30 days began. Dr. Siona Marsh had a habit that drove her colleagues slightly mad. When she was thinking hard, she did not pace or write or stare at whiteboards. She sat completely still and ate whatever was closest to her hand, whether it was dinner or a pen cap or someone else's lunch. The brain scans of 11 Voakai champions were open on her screen, and she had been sitting with them for 3 days. The cold rice container was long gone. She was now on her second bag of salted crackers. What she was looking at was not what anyone else in the room was looking at. Everyone else was looking at the obvious things: the muscle density, the reaction time scores, the bone reinforcement data. All of it was extraordinary, the result of a species that had spent thousands of years breeding and engineering itself for exactly one purpose. But Marsh was looking at something smaller, quieter. She was looking at the part of the Voakai brain that processed incoming movement data and turned it into a response. It was perfect, that was the problem. A normal nervous system, human or most other species, received information, processed it, guessed at the pattern, and reacted. It was messy, full of noise and error and correction. The Voakai nervous system did something different. It did not guess, it recognized. 11 lifetimes of combat data, encoded deep into their neurology, allowed a Voakai champion to see the first movement of an attack and know, with extraordinary precision, exactly where that attack was going to go and exactly how to counter it before it arrived. They could not be outmuscled. They could not be outsped. But they were reading a pattern, and a pattern required regularity. Marsh put down the crackers. "They're reading sheet music," she said, to no one in particular. "If there's no sheet music, they have to improvise, and they've never had to improvise." She wrote one sentence in her report and sent it to Admiral Wynne. "The human brain generates irregular movement sequences that the Voakai nervous system cannot categorize in real time. This is not a weakness we built. It is one we were born with. Our fighter should be selected not for strength or speed, but for the least predictable combat record in our entire military database." Wynne read it once, then she made a single call. Sergeant Rael Obi was on maintenance duty when the call came. He was fixing a ventilation panel in a corridor that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and he had grease on both hands. He was 34 years old, of average height, with a build that his physical trainer had once diplomatically described as functional. His service record was 11 engagements across 4 different conflict zones. He had never once followed a standard engagement protocol. His commanding officers wrote his evaluations with visible frustration. One of them had written, verbatim, "Obi continues to be alive through methods I cannot explain and do not endorse." He was not the largest soldier in the human military. He was not the fastest. He was, however, the soldier who had been in the most impossible situations and come out of all of them by doing something that no training manual had ever suggested. He arrived at the selection facility, still wearing the grease. He was told what was happening. He was shown the Voakai footage. He watched Champion Ura, 7 feet of engineered muscle moving through a combat drill with the cold precision of a machine, and he did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "He moves like he already knows what I'm going to do." "Yes," Marsh said, "that's the entire point. So I just have to not know what I'm going to do either." There was a pause in the room. "Essentially," Marsh said. "I can do that," Rail said. "I do that anyway. My old sergeant used to say I fought like a man falling downstairs." Your old sergeant was accidentally describing a neurological advantage. "I'll tell him that, he'll hate it." The training period was not what anyone outside Earth expected. The galaxy was watching. Every species had trained long-range observation on the human preparation facilities, assuming they would see the standard champion preparation: isolation, physical enhancement, drilling the same combat sequences 10,000 times until they became reflex. What they saw instead looked, to most alien observers, like a large group of humans doing strange and unrelated things. Rail was not drilling. He was sparring against opponents who changed randomly. He was climbing structures with no predetermined route. He was doing everything his trainers could think of to make sure his body never repeated the same sequence twice. Meanwhile, Champion Ura was drilling. His sessions were recorded and leaked, deliberately, by the Voakai. They wanted the galaxy to see. Every strike was a masterwork. Every sequence was flawless. Species that had hoped for a human victory watched Ura train and went quietly back to hopping for a merciful loss. On the 28th day, Rail sat in the prep facility eating a sandwich and watching old archived footage of street fights. Not military combat. Street fights. Messy, panicked, ugly exchanges between people who were scared and had no training and were just trying to survive. His trainers found him there and asked what he was doing. "Reminding myself," he said. "Of what?" He took another bite. "That it doesn't have to look good, it just has to work." He went asleep early. He did not meditate. He did not visualize. He set an alarm and was unconscious in under 4 minutes, which was the kind of thing that only happened to people who had learned, through long experience, that worrying was not the same as preparing. 2 days later, the human delegation departed for the trial of blades. In the assembly, an old being named Watcher Lu filed a short note to the council. "I have observed 47 species accept this challenge. I have not, until now, observed a species that seemed to understand what they were doing." The arena existed in the dark between stars. It was a sphere of black metal, ancient and cold, built by the Voakai 10,000 years ago when their empire was young, and the trial of blades was their favorite way to end arguments with smaller civilizations. Inside, gravity plates held the floor flat. The walls absorbed light. There was no atmosphere. Combatants relied on sealed suits. The Voakai had designed it this way deliberately. Most species panicked in a vacuum. The silence of it, the absolute absence of natural sound, reduced lesser fighters to creatures acting on pure terror. Rail had done 3 months of zero-atmosphere training. He had also done 4 actual zero-atmosphere engagements in real conflict zones. The silence felt familiar to him. He had learned, a long time ago, to treat silence as a room he was comfortable in. He entered from the human side of the sphere. No ceremony, no announcer. The Voakai did not give opposing species the dignity of introduction. The arena simply opened and he walked in, and the door sealed behind him. Across the floor, Champion Ura was already there. Even through a suit, even at a distance, Ura was enormous. 7 feet tall, with the kind of mass that came from a body engineered over generations for a single purpose. He stood completely still, and that stillness was its own kind of violence. The stillness of a system fully loaded, fully ready, waiting for the first input. Every delegation watching through the observation glass had its own reaction. Most of them looked at Ura and looked away. Some of them could not look away. The Voakai in their box were calm with the calm of people who had seen this 11 times before and already knew how it ended. Rail crossed to the center line. He looked at Ura the way a person looks at a large piece of furniture they are about to move, not with fear, but with the practical assessment of something that is going to require effort. Then he nodded. Not a bow, not a salute. A nod, the way you nod at a colleague in a hallway. Ura did not react to the nod. His combat systems were already running. The fight started without signal. The Voakai did not use bells or horns. Ura simply moved. The first combination was a 7-strike sequence that had ended every previous trial of blades. It was not a violent sequence in the way that looked violent on recordings. It was precise, clinical, each strike flowing into the next like a piece of mathematics. The Voakai in the observation box watched it with something close to satisfaction. It was always beautiful. It was always over quickly. Rail did not block it cleanly. He caught the first strike badly, turned wrong, stumbled, took a glancing impact on his left shoulder, and ended up in a crooked, awkward position that no trained fighter would ever deliberately occupy. Every single movement read as incompetent. Several alien delegates in the observation ring actually looked away, because watching something helpless get hurt was uncomfortable. Ura paused. His combat systems had loaded the pattern from the first strike. They had generated the next 4 moves based on how the human moved, where his weight was, how his limbs tracked. All of it was automatic, faster than thought. But the human had not moved the way any opponent had ever moved. The second strike had already been in motion when the human stumbled, and the stumble had put him in a position that the second strike was not built for. And so, the second strike had landed at a fraction of its intended force. And now the human was at an angle that Ura's pattern system was trying to read and could not cleanly read, and so Ura stopped. It lasted less than a second. No one watching noticed it except Dr. Marsh, who was watching from the human observation section with her hands very still in her lap, and Watcher Lou, who noticed everything. They reset. The fight continued. It went on for 40 minutes. This was not supposed to happen. The previous 11 trials had lasted an average of 3 minutes combined. Ura was not losing. He was landing strikes, scoring impacts, and by every technical standard of Voakai combat was ahead on points by a significant margin. But he could not finish it. Every time he built a model of what the human was going to do, the human did something else. Not a better thing, not a smarter thing, just a different thing, an ugly and irregular and unpredictable thing. And the fraction of a second it took Ura's system to adjust kept saving Rail from the specific kind of strike that would end him. Rail was bleeding from his lip inside the helmet. His left shoulder ached. He was tired in the way you get tired when something enormous has been hitting you for 40 minutes. But he was still standing, and every time he stood up, he did it from a slightly different angle. In the 43rd minute, Ura loaded a strike combination that he had used twice before in the fight. His pattern system had noted that the human recovered from left-side impacts by stepping right. It was the one repeating behavior Ura had detected. He built the combination around it. He threw the first strike. Rail stepped left. It was not strategy. He did it because the right side felt wrong in that moment, and he had spent his entire career trusting when things felt wrong. He stepped left, and Ura's combination, built entirely for a rightward step, landed on empty air, and the force of it carried Ura slightly past his own balance point. And Rail, without thinking, without a plan, simply did the one thing that the gap in front of him made possible. Ura went down. Rail pinned him. His hands were shaking, partly from exhaustion, partly from something else he did not have a word for. The arena was silent for 3 full seconds. Then, from the human observation section, there was a sound. It was not a cheer, exactly. It was too complicated for a cheer. It was 40-odd humans releasing something they had been holding in their chests for 30 days. Watcher Lou set down her pen. In 400 years of service, she had never set her pen down before she finished her notes. She sat with the moment for a while, because some moments deserved that. Across the floor, Rael let go of Ura's arm and stood up. He looked at nothing in particular. He breathed. The first thing the Volkai did was file a complaint. It arrived at the Galactic Assembly's legal office approximately 19 minutes after the trial ended, which was fast enough that it had clearly been written before the result was confirmed, which meant the Volkai had prepared it in advance as a contingency, which meant some part of them had known, somewhere underneath the certainty, that losing was possible. Grand Warlord Draven Sek did not come to the assembly floor. He sent Voice Yeth, his political handler, a thin man with the practiced composure of someone who had delivered bad news for a living. Yeth stood at the podium and spoke for 40 minutes about procedural irregularities, unverified medical submissions, and anomalous duration metrics. He used the word aberrant 11 times. He used the word invalid 7 times. He used the phrase pending review so often that the Assembly's translation systems eventually started summarizing it as a stutter. The Assembly rejected the complaint in full. The vote was not close. Under the law, the result stood. Humanity was free, sovereign, and completely outside the reach of Volkai dominion for the foreseeable future. 3 junior members of the Assembly, small species that had been quietly managing trade agreements under Volkai administrative guidance for decades, immediately petitioned for independence hearings. One of them sent a private message to Prime Delegate Vassi that contained no words, only a symbol from their culture that, when translated, meant approximately, "We saw what you did. We did not know it was possible." Vassi wrote back, "It was not easy, but it was possible. That is the part worth remembering." Rael came home to a situation he was not prepared for. Not the fight he had been ready for. What he had not been ready for was the 47 media requests waiting in his official inbox, the invitation to appear before the Earth Congress, the offer of a rank promotion, and the dockworker named Bayo who had started a fundraiser in his name. He looked at all of it, set his phone face down on the table, and called his squad. They made fun of him for the stumble in round 1 for approximately 40 minutes. Then someone bought drinks and they stopped talking about the trial entirely, the way soldiers always stopped talking about the thing they had all been thinking about the moment there was a beer and a bad joke available. Rael slept better that night than he had in a month. But Dr. Marsh did not sleep at all. She was too busy. Her report on Volkai neurological pattern dependency had gone from a classified intelligence document to the most discussed scientific paper in the galaxy in under 48 hours. The Assembly's Science Council had formally requested her presence. Researchers from 6 different species sent her messages, some in their own languages, not bothering to translate, so excited they forgot she might not read Drevosi or Pelath, asking for the raw data, asking for her methodology, asking if the same neurological pattern applied to other engineered species. The answer to that last question was probably yes, and the implications were enormous. She also received one message from an anonymous Volkai address. It said, in plain text, "You exploited a private biological vulnerability and published it without consent. This is a violation." She thought about that for a while. Then she wrote back, "Your government used that vulnerability to conquer 11 species and enslave their populations. I used it to stop you from making it 12. I will not apologize for that. But I will, genuinely, be glad if this eventually leads to a better conversation." She did not get a reply, but the message was not returned, which meant someone on the other end had read it. Admiral Wynne did something that surprised the entire Security Council. She stood up in closed session, on the day after the greatest human military victory in galactic history, and argued for mercy. Not forgiveness. She was not naive about what the Volkai had done to 11 species over 4 centuries, but mercy. Specifically, She argued that the council should not use this moment to punish the Volcae beyond the legal penalties already binding them. She argued that a Volcae dominion with nothing to lose and its pride destroyed was a far more dangerous thing than a Volcae dominion that had been beaten, clearly, fairly, and offered a path forward. "We did not win so we could become what we beat," she said. Half the council thought she was foolish. The other half sat quietly with it, the way you sit with something when you know it is right but you have not yet figured out how to argue for it. The debate was tabled, for now. Out in the broader galaxy, something was happening that no one had planned and no one could stop. The footage of the trial, all 43 minutes of it, was spreading, not just among species who had witnessed it in the assembly, among ordinary people on ordinary worlds, going about ordinary lives that had looked, for a very long time, like they would always exist in the shadow of a dominion that could not be beaten. Drevosi workers who had been in administrative servitude for generations watched the footage in break rooms on Volcae-administered stations. They did not celebrate loudly. They were not free yet, but there was something in their eyes, in the way they turned back to their work, that had not been there before. The Volcae were watching all of this from behind their diplomatic offices. Grand Warlord Sect was watching it from his private suite, on a screen he had not turned off in 3 days. Voice Yeth knocked on his door 3 times and received no answer. On the 4th knock, Sect opened the door. He looked at Yeth for a moment. Then he said quietly the question that had been eating him since the moment Ura hit the floor. How did they know? Yeth did not have an answer. Nobody on the Volcae side did. And that, more than the loss itself, was what kept Sect awake every night that followed. They had been beaten not by strength, not by a weapon, not by some technological trick. They had been beaten by something the human possessed without even knowing she possessed it, something the Volcae had never thought to measure because they had never imagined it could matter. He turned back to the screen. The footage was still playing. The human was still standing there in the arena, breathing, doing nothing dramatic, just standing. Sect watched it for a long time. The declaration arrived not as a signal, but as a fleet. 47 Volcae warships dropped out of transit at the edge of human space on a quiet morning, and they did not hail, did not negotiate, and did not send a legal notice to the assembly. They simply crossed the border and began moving inward. Attached to the crossing was a single short transmission, addressed to every species in the galaxy. The trial result has been found internally invalid. The right of dominion stands. Any species that interferes in the correction will be treated as a hostile combatant. Grand Warlord Sect had invoked the ancient Dominion War Clause, a provision so old that most assembly legal scholars had considered it a historical footnote rather than an active law. It bypassed the trial system entirely. No single combat, no neutral arena, just the full force of the greatest military in the galaxy pointed at a species that had embarrassed them. The assembly erupted. The Volcae ambassador's feed was cut off mid-sentence by the presiding council member, which had never happened in assembly history. Species that had quietly disliked humanity, species that had stayed neutral, species that had no particular feelings about humans one way or the other, all of them looked at the fleet footage and saw the same thing. If the Volcae could simply ignore a legal result the moment it went against them, then no law in the galaxy meant anything at all. 3 of the newly petitioning species sent military support offers to humanity within 2 hours. Not large fleets, but real ones. An ancient trade federation species called the Pelath, who had never once contributed military force to any conflict in 400 years of assembly membership, sent a message to Prime Delegate Vassi that said only, "We remember what it cost us to stay quiet last time. We will not stay quiet again." Vassi accepted every offer. Then he forwarded all of it to Admiral Wynne and wrote, "Your war, Admiral, please do not lose it." What Sect expected was a defensive line, a wall of human ships at the border holding position, buying time, hoping the assembly would intervene before the Volcae could push through. This was what every previous target had done: build a wall. Hold it as long as possible, wait for help or for the inevitable. What he got instead was silence. The border was empty. Human ships were not at the border. Human ships were not, as far as Volkai sensor systems could determine, anywhere in formation at all. Sek's fleet moved inward, cautious now where it had been confident before, and found human space looking, from a military standpoint, completely undefended. On the fourth day of the advance, a Volkai supply convoy bringing fuel for the fleet's forward elements simply vanished. 40 ships, no distress signal, no wreckage, just gone as if the transit lane they had been traveling had swallowed them. On the seventh day, 3 communication relays that the fleet depended on for coordinated orders went dark simultaneously. Not destroyed, the Volkai sent scouts to investigate and found them intact, drifting, with their control systems replaced by hardware no Volkai engineer could identify. The humans had not blown them up. They had stolen them. On the 12th day, a Volkai forward staging post, a heavily armed installation that was supposed to be the anchor of the fleet's advance, reported that its water recycling systems had begun producing something that was, technically, water, but with trace compounds that made the Volkai crew mildly, persistently nauseated. Not sick enough to stop functioning, just sick enough to think slower and make small errors. The installation commander sent an urgent request back to Fleet Command asking for engineers. The request traveled along the communication network, which humans had been quietly accessing for days, and arrived at Fleet Command 7 hours later than it should have, garbled enough to read as a routine status report. Wynne was not fighting the Volkai fleet. She was eating the fleet's ability to function as a fleet. She had spent her career studying what happens to large military organizations when they cannot trust their own infrastructure. The answer was always the same. They slow down. They second-guess. Commanders who were trained to make fast decisions in clean information environments start to hesitate when the information stops being clean. Hesitation at the command level travels downward. Units stop acting with the confidence that made them dangerous. The Volkai were still enormous, still well-armed, still technically capable of burning human worlds if they reached them. But they were no longer moving like a force that had 111 trials. They were moving like something that was starting to understand it had walked into a room it did not know. On the 31st day of the invasion, Sekt ordered a decisive engagement. He chose the human colony of Braxton's Gate, a mid-sized settlement, strategically significant as a transit hub, the kind of target that the Volkai military doctrine said would force the defenders to commit their main fleet to protect it. If he could destroy the human fleet in one engagement, he could end the supply line bleeding, restore his communication network, and proceed on force alone. He sent 22 of his 47 ships to Braxton's Gate. What he had not known, what human signals intelligence had carefully ensured he did not know, was that Braxton's Gate had been quietly evacuated 3 weeks earlier. The sensor readings showing normal colony activity were a construction of equipment the humans had left behind specifically for this purpose. There was no civilian population at Braxton's Gate. There was also no main human fleet. There was, instead, the combined force of humanity and 4 allied species, hitting the 22 Volkai ships from 5 directions at once. The remaining 25 Volkai ships, still deep in human space, received no orders for 6 hours. When the orders finally came, they were a single word repeated: withdraw. The Volkai did not win at Braxton's Gate. They did not escape from Braxton's Gate cleanly either. What was left of Sekt's forward force limped back toward the border in a way that no Volkai fleet had ever moved before, not with the purposeful retreat of a force choosing better ground, but with the stumbling, damaged, disorganized movement of something that had been taken apart piece by piece and did not fully understand how. Wynne watched the withdrawal on her screens and did not celebrate. She told her staff to start preparing the ceasefire terms. She wanted them ready before the Volkai requested them. She already knew they were going to request them. Grand Warlord Draven Sect surrendered on a Tuesday. Not because of any particular significance the day carried. The Volkai did not observe human calendar systems. But that was what it was, a Tuesday, unremarkable and flat, the kind of day that history should not have chosen for something this large. The ceasefire transmission came in at 400 Assembly Standard Time. It used the legal language of formal capitulation, which was a dead form that no one had used in 400 years because no one had ever needed to use it. Someone in the Volkai diplomatic office had looked it up. The ceasefire terms were not what the Volkai expected. There were no demands for territorial annexation, no reparations in the form of servitude, no public humiliation ceremonies, no symbolic destruction of Volkai cultural sites, none of the things that the Dominion had imposed on the 11 species it had defeated in the trials. Admiral Wynne had drafted the terms herself, and she had drafted them as if she were writing a blueprint for something she wanted to actually last. The Dominion would be dissolved. The species it administered would return to self-governance, with assembly support for the transition period. The Volkai people, not the military command, not the Warlord Council, but the ordinary Volkai who had been born into an empire they did not choose, would be offered full assembly membership as a peer species, with equal rights and equal obligations. Sect and the senior command would face an assembly legal review. Not execution. Review. Sect read the terms 3 times. Then he asked the one question he had been carrying since the trial, the question that Yeth could not answer, the question that had kept him watching that arena footage night after night. He asked it now in a direct transmission to Wynne herself. He asked it plainly, without ceremony or diplomatic framing. How did you know, not the fight, the whole war, how did you know we would make every mistake we made? Wynne took her time before she answered. Then she said, "We did not know. We built a picture of how you think and we worked inside that picture, but we were also ready to be wrong. The difference between your doctrine and ours is that yours required certainty before you could act, and ours was built to function without it. We are very comfortable not knowing. We have been not knowing things for a very long time." Sect was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is either very wise or very strange." "Probably both," Wynne said. The Assembly ratified the ceasefire with the largest majority vote in its history. The Dravosi delegation, who had been in Volkai servitude for 4 centuries and were now, for the first time in living memory, sitting in the Assembly as a free people, did not speak during the vote. They did not need to. The way they voted said everything. Watcher Lu filed her final report on the conflict and then requested retirement, which she had apparently been considering for the past 200 years and had simply never found a good stopping point for. She was the oldest continuously serving Assembly observer, and she had seen things that most species would not believe. Her final report on humanity was 12 pages long, which was more than she had written about any species in her career. The last paragraph said, "They are not the strongest. They are not the fastest. They have no gift that any other species does not also possess in some form. But they combine their gifts in a way that is genuinely difficult to predict, and they continue functioning in conditions that should, by any reasonable model, have stopped them. I have watched civilizations older and more powerful than humanity collapse under pressure far smaller than what this species has survived. I do not know what their ceiling is. I am not certain they have one." She signed it, submitted it, and went home, or the closest thing she had to one. Rael Obi took the promotion they offered him, eventually, but only the one that let him keep teaching. 2 years after the trial, he ran a training program at a joint academy that had been one of the first institutions set up under the Volkai integration framework. His students were human and Volkai in roughly equal numbers, which was an arrangement that should have been tense and sometimes was, but mostly was not. Because Rael had a way of running a training floor that made tension feel like a waste of time. A young Volkai trainee, first generation to be born outside the Dominion system, studying alongside humans by his own choice, rather than his government's orders, stayed after a session one day to ask Rael the question that sect had asked Win, the question that apparently everyone eventually asked. What was the secret? What had he known, going into the arena, that let him win? Rael thought about it the way he always thought about things, slowly, without performing the thinking. "Nothing," he said. "I didn't know anything going in. I didn't have a plan. I just kept going because stopping felt worse." The trainee considered this. His face did the thing that Volkai faces did when they were processing something their culture had no category for. Then he said, "That is not a strategy." "No," Rael said, "it's not." "Then how is it enough?" Rael picked up his training bag and slung it over his shoulder. "I have no idea, but it has been every single time so far." The trainee stood with that for a while. Somewhere across the galaxy, Dr. Siona Marsh received a research paper. It came from a Volkai academic address, no name, but a real institutional affiliation, which meant someone had submitted it through official channels and accepted the professional exposure that came with that. The paper was a study of human neural architecture. Specifically, it examined the relationship between irregular neural firing patterns and adaptive behavior under high-stress, unpredictable conditions. It was good work, careful, thorough, and honest in the way that good science is honest, including in its conclusion, which noted that the Volkai nervous system, despite its extraordinary performance in stable, high-pattern environments, had a significant and previously unexamined vulnerability to chaotic input sequences. The title, translated from Volkai, read, "On the Danger of Mistaking Messiness for Weakness." Marsh sat with it for a long moment. Then she sent back a single line, "Welcome to the conversation." She got a reply 3 days later, just 2 words, "Thank you." She added the paper to the reading list for her first-year students. All species welcome. That was how it started, not with a treaty or a ceremony or a speech, but with 2 scientists on opposite sides of a very ugly conflict deciding that what they understood about each other was more interesting than what they feared. It was small. It was slow. It was, in the long run, probably the most important thing that happened. The galaxy, which had watched humanity stumble through an impossible arena fight and then dismantle an empire with a patience no one had modeled for, went on. It was noisier now than it had been, more complicated, more contested, more honest. Which was, when you thought about it, exactly what humans were like.